At some point, you just have to discard what's no longer useful. The words hit me from behind a closed door, colder than a Vermont winter. The polished wood of the door was smooth under my trembling fingers, and her laughter felt like a shard of glass in my heart. She thought she was talking about a piece of old furniture, but she was talking about me. What she didn't know is that my late husband left behind more than a creamery. He left a final, brilliant play that only I knew how to execute. Stay with me until the end, subscribe, leave a like, and please, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It's a comfort to know how far a story can travel. My name is Margaret Caldwell, and I am 78 years old. For most of my life, the sun rising over the green mountains has been my clock, and the sharp, earthy smell of aging cheddar has been the air I breathe. Our farm, the Caldwell Creamery, isn't just a business. It's a living thing, a legacy passed down from my grandparents. My hands, stained and wrinkled, know every secret in the cool, damp air of the aging cellar. It was in that cellar that my late husband, Robert, and I built not just a life, but a promise to each other, that this land, this work, would always be the heart of our family. That morning, the day of the rehearsal dinner, the air felt different. It was heavy, carrying a strange stillness that even the birds seemed to respect. I was in my medicinal herb garden, crushing mint leaves between my fingers, the familiar scent usually a comfort. But today, it did nothing to soothe the knot in my stomach. My son, Arthur, my only child, was getting married. He's a good man, with a heart as soft as the cheese we make in the spring, but he is easily led. And his fiancée, Tiffany, a woman from Boston with a smile as bright and hard as a diamond, was the one leading him. We drove to the venue she had chosen, a modern, sterile place with vast glass windows that seemed to judge the rustic beauty of our Woodstock Valley. I felt like a weathered stone barn in a city of skyscrapers. The air inside hummed with forced air and expensive perfume, a world away from the scent of hay and honest work. I tried to smile, to be the gracious matriarch everyone expected, but a sense of dread clung to me like the damp evening chill. Needing a moment of quiet, I excused myself, heading toward the restrooms down a quiet, carpeted hallway. That's when I heard her voice, Tiffany's. It was light, animated, laced with the casual cruelty of someone who believes they are unobserved. As soon as we're married, we'll convince him to move Margaret into a luxury senior living community, she said to her bridesmaid. The sound of her sipping champagne followed. She's old. She doesn't get the business anymore. She's dead weight holding us back from expanding. Then came the final blow, the words that cracked the foundation of my world. At some point, you just have to discard what's no longer useful. The word discard hung in the air, echoing in the silent hallway. It wasn't just a word. It was a verdict. It was the sound of my life's work being dismissed, my love being recategorized as a liability. For a long moment, I couldn't move. My hand rested on the cool, unfeeling wood of the door, my knuckles white. I could hear their muffled laughter on the other side, and the sound made my blood run cold. My breath caught in my throat, a sharp, painful thing. I was not a person to them. I was an obstacle, an old chair to be thrown out. Slowly, I pulled my hand back. I looked at the liver spots and the fine, wrinkled skin over the bones. These were the hands that had rocked my son to sleep, that had held my husband's as he took his last breath, that had shaped and salted every wheel of cheese that paid for the very suit Arthur was wearing tonight. The instinct to burst in, to confront them, was a fire in my chest. But a deeper, colder instinct took over. The kind of patience you learn from watching cheese age for years. I couldn't show them my pain. That would be a victory for her. I turned and walked back down the hallway, each step feeling heavy, deliberate. The cheerful noise of the party grew louder, a wave of sound that felt alien and hostile. I had to face them. I had to sit at a table with my son and the woman who had just sentenced me to obsolescence, and I had to smile. The air was thick with the smell of roasted duck and wine, but all I could smell was the sharp metallic scent of betrayal. My heart, which had felt so full of a nervous sort of hope an hour ago, was now just a hollow, aching space in my chest. When I re-entered the room, the first person I saw was Arthur. He was smiling, his eyes scanning the crowd for me. When he saw me, his face lit up with that familiar, boyish relief that always melted my heart. He came over and took my arm, his touch gentle. "There you are, Mom." I was getting worried. He led me back to our table, completely oblivious to the storm raging inside me. How could I look at my own son, at his trusting, happy face, and not let him see that my world had just been shattered by the woman holding his other hand? I sat down, the plush chair feeling like a block of ice. Tiffany looked at me, her smile perfect, her eyes glittering. "Feeling all right, Margaret? You look a little pale." Her concern was a performance, a perfectly crafted lie. I wanted to tell her I had just overheard my own eulogy, delivered with the casual indifference of a business transaction. Instead, I just nodded, my throat too tight to form words. The clinking of silverware on porcelain sounded like hammers, each strike chipping away at my composure. I felt trapped, a silent spectator at my own undoing. Arthur squeezed my hand under the table. "Isn't she wonderful, Mom?" he whispered, his gaze fixed on Tiffany with pure adoration. The question was a physical blow. Wonderful. He saw a bright, ambitious partner who would elevate our family business. I now saw a corporate raider who saw our legacy as mere assets and me as dead weight. I could feel the chasm between us widening with every passing second, a deep, silent canyon of her making. I simply squeezed his hand back, a gesture that felt like the biggest lie I had ever told. The room was filled with strangers from Tiffany's world, bankers, investors, people with smooth hands and sharp suits who talked about market shares and branding. They spoke of the Caldwell Creamery not as a living history, but as an under-leveraged brand with significant growth potential. Each phrase was a sanitized insult to the memory of my husband and his father before him. I watched Tiffany navigate these conversations with a predatory grace, her laughter echoing the sound I'd heard from behind the bathroom door. She was already selling off pieces of our soul before the wedding cake was even cut. My mind kept replaying her words. Discard what's no longer useful. It wasn't just about putting me in a home. It was about erasing me. Erasing the old ways, the slow process, the stubborn refusal to cut corners that made our cheddar famous. She wanted to turn our craft into a factory, our story into a marketing slogan. And my son, my dear blind Arthur, was handing her the keys, believing it was love. A profound and chilling loneliness settled over me, colder and more permanent than any Vermont winter I had ever endured. One of Tiffany's friends, a bridesmaid with a vapid smile, stood up to make a toast. She spoke of Tiffany's vision and drive. As she rambled on, my thoughts drifted back to Robert. He was a man of few words, but his judgment was as solid as the granite hills behind our farm. He had been quiet around Tiffany, observing her with a stillness that I had misinterpreted as simple shyness. Now, I understood it was assessment. He had seen the ambition that I had tried to frame as passion. He saw the cold calculation I had mistaken for intelligence. I remembered a conversation we'd had on the porch one evening, not long before he passed. The fireflies were blinking in the twilight, and the air was sweet with the smell of cut grass. "Be careful, Maggie," he had said, his voice quiet but firm. "Some people see a beautiful old tree and appreciate its shade and its history. Others just see lumber." At the time, I thought he was being overly protective, a father worried about his son. Now I realized it was a warning I had completely and utterly failed to heed. That memory was a key turning in a lock I didn't know existed. It wasn't just this one cruel comment. It was a pattern. The way Tiffany would gently mock the old equipment, calling it charming but inefficient. The suggestions she made about streamlining production, which always involved replacing people Robert had trained for decades. The subtle way she isolated me from business meetings, framing it as, "Don't you worry about this, Margaret. You should be relaxing." It wasn't about my well-being. It was a slow, methodical coup. And now Tiffany herself was standing, raising her glass. "To family," she said, her eyes sweeping the room and landing on me with a brilliant, false warmth. To honoring the legacy that the Caldwells have built and to carrying it into a bold, new future. The hypocrisy was so profound, it almost made me laugh. She was toasting a legacy she intended to gut and sell for parts. She spoke of family while plotting to discard its matriarch. I felt the gazes of everyone at the table on me, expecting a benevolent, tearful smile. I gave them a mask. Inside, a new feeling was beginning to smolder beneath the shock and the pain. It was a slow-burning anger, the kind that doesn't scream, but plans, the kind that waits, patiently, like a wheel of cheddar aging in the dark, gathering its strength and its sharpness. They thought I was a relic, a gentle old woman to be managed and eventually put away. They had made a critical miscalculation. They had mistaken my silence for weakness. They had forgotten that the oldest trees have the deepest roots. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur of fake smiles and meaningless chatter. I watched my son, so happy, so completely unaware of the precipice on which his future was being built. To shatter his happiness would be to break my own heart, but to stand by and watch Tiffany dismantle everything Robert and I had built, to let her discard me from my own life, that was unthinkable. For the first time, I understood I was in a war, and it had been declared without my knowledge. I ate nothing. The exquisite food tasted like ash in my mouth. My mind was racing, sifting through memories, conversations, and legal documents stored away in Robert's old oak desk. He was a shrewd man, my Robert. A farmer, yes, but he understood people, and he understood contracts. He had always planned for the future, for every contingency. A flicker of an idea, a half-remembered clause in his will, began to take shape in the back of my mind. It was a desperate, terrifying thought, but it was also the first glimmer of light in a very dark room. The drive home was silent. Arthur hummed along softly to the radio, lost in his own blissful world. The headlights cut through the darkness of the winding country roads, illuminating the familiar trees and stone walls of our home. Usually, this drive soothed me, but tonight, the darkness felt like it was closing in. I was an old woman against a young, ruthless ambition. What power did I truly have? The doubts began to creep back in, cold and sharp. When we pulled into the driveway, the old farmhouse stood waiting, its windows dark. It looked sturdy and permanent, a bastion of our family's history. But I knew now how fragile it all was. One signature on a marriage license, and the wrecking ball would start to swing. Arthur walked me to the door, kissed my cheek, and said, "Good night, Mom. I'm so happy." The words were meant to be a comfort, but they felt like a cage. He was happy because he was blind. I stood at the door and watched his car's taillights disappear down the long driveway, leaving me alone in the profound silence of the Vermont night. The knot in my stomach was gone, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. The struggle was no longer just internal. She had drawn a battle line. She thought I was dead weight, an inconvenience to be managed. She had no idea that she had just woken something up inside. Me. Something that had been dormant for a very long time. Alone in the quiet house, the smell of coffee and cheddar felt like an embrace from the past, a reminder of what was at stake. I walked not to my bedroom, but to Robert's old study. The air was still, thick with the scent of old books and pipe tobacco. I ran my hand over the smooth, worn surface of his desk. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, not exactly, but I knew the fight for my life, and for the soul of the Caldwell Creamery, had just begun. I was cornered, yes, but even a cornered animal is at its most dangerous. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed once, marking midnight. In Robert's study, time seemed to stand still. I switched on his old brass desk lamp, and a warm, golden circle of light pushed back the shadows, illuminating a world that hadn't changed since the day he died. The scent of his pipe tobacco was still embedded in the leather of his chair, a ghostly comfort that made my throat ache. My hands, still cold from the night air, rested on the aged oak of the desk. I wasn't just in a room. I was inside a memory, and I was searching for an answer from a man who could no longer speak. My fingers traced the edges of the drawers, the smooth, worn wood a familiar landscape under my touch. I started with the top left, the one he always kept his account ledgers in. The pages were filled with his neat, deliberate handwriting, a testament to a life of careful planning and honest work. Each entry told a story of a good year, a lean winter, a new piece of equipment bought and paid for. This was the legacy Tiffany saw as a balance sheet, a thing to be leveraged and exploited. For me, it was the diary of our shared life, written in numbers and ink. I moved from drawer to drawer, my search growing more aimless, more desperate. What was I even looking for? A loophole? A forgotten savings account? Some small bit of leverage to cling to? The thought felt foolish, the act of a scared old woman rummaging through the past for a weapon that didn't exist. Tiffany was the future, all sharp edges, corporate speak, and ruthless efficiency. I was just a ghost in my own home, a relic whose only purpose was to eventually be moved out of the way. The despair was a physical weight, pressing down on my shoulders. In the bottom right drawer, tucked beneath a stack of old property deeds and tax records, my fingers brushed against something different. It wasn't a file or a folder. It was a thick manila envelope, sealed with a heavy wax stamp bearing the Caldwell family crest, a simple C entwined with an oak leaf. On the front, in Robert's unmistakable script, were 5 words that made my heart stop. For Maggie's eyes only, in case of a storm. My breath hitched. He had known. Somehow, in some way, my cautious, quiet husband had foreseen a storm coming for me. My hands trembled so badly I could barely break the seal. The wax crumbled under my thumbnail, and the sound was like a gunshot in the silent house. Inside wasn't a single document, but several, clipped together with a letter on top. The paper was heavy, official. I unfolded the letter first. His handwriting was as clear as the day he wrote it, and I could almost hear his voice in the words, that low, steady rumble that had always been my anchor. "My dearest Maggie," it began, "if you are reading this, then the world has shown its teeth, and you are feeling alone." He wrote that he had always trusted my judgment, of character more than his own, but that he had seen a flicker of something in Arthur's boundless optimism that worried him, a tendency to see only the good in people, even when the good wasn't there. He said he hoped this letter would yellow and crumble with age, never to be read. But a good farmer always prepares for a drought in a season of rain. He had prepared for this. He had prepared for a Tiffany, even if he never knew her name. The letter was a comfort, but it was also a confirmation of my deepest fears. The documents attached were an amendment to his will, a private trust agreement he had established years ago, legally notarized and filed with our family lawyer in Woodstock. It wasn't about money, not directly. It was about power, control. The document was titled The Matriarch's Clause, a name so unlike Robert's usual plain speaking that it must have been our lawyer's idea of a flourish. But the contents were pure Robert, simple, direct, and as unmovable as the granite. Mountains outside our window. I had to read it 3 times for the full weight of it to sink in. The clause was brilliant in its simplicity. It stipulated that as the surviving co-founder of the Caldwell Creamery, all major strategic decisions, including any sale of assets over $10,000, any change to the company's core product line, or any alteration of the corporate structure, required my unanimous, written consent. My signature was a veto. Without it, Arthur could run the day-to-day operations, but he couldn't fundamentally change, gut, or sell the business. I wasn't just a figurehead. I was the gatekeeper. But there was a second part, a masterstroke of Robert's protective foresight. He had tied the clause directly to my residency. The document stated, with cold legal precision, that should I ever be moved from the Caldwell family farmhouse for any reason other than a medical necessity certified by 2 independent physicians, my controlling shares in the creamery would immediately and irrevocably be transferred to a charitable trust dedicated to preserving Vermont's traditional farming heritage. He had made me the living soul of the company. To discard me was to destroy the very prize Tiffany was after. For a long moment, I just sat there, the papers resting in my lap, the weight of them both a shield and a terrible burden. He had armed me. Robert had reached out from beyond the grave and handed me a weapon of immense power. I could stop her. I could stop everything. The relief was so profound it felt like I could finally breathe again after being underwater. The cold dread that had settled in my bones began to recede, replaced by a surge of strength, a feeling I hadn't realized I'd lost since Robert passed. I was not helpless. But then, another image flooded my mind. Arthur's face at the dinner. His smile, so full of unadulterated joy. His whispered words, "Isn't she wonderful, Mom?" Using this power would mean declaring war on the woman he loved. It would mean shattering his happiness, forcing him to see the cold, calculating ambition behind her perfect smile. It would force him to choose between his mother and his future wife. Could I do that to my only child? The thought was a shard of ice in my heart. The power I held was the power to protect a legacy, but also the power to destroy a family. Tiffany's cruelty was a known thing now, a certainty. But Arthur's love for her was just as real, however misguided. To expose her would be an act of love for him, wouldn't it? A painful, necessary surgery to cut out a cancer before it spread. Or would it be a selfish act, a mother refusing to let go, destroying her son's future because she couldn't accept the woman he had chosen? The doubt was agonizing, a serpent coiling in my gut. I walked to the window and looked out at the sleeping farm. The moonlight cast a silver glow on the old barn, the pastures, the dark line of the mountains against the starry sky. This was my life's work. This was Robert's. It was more than land and buildings. It was a promise we had made to the past and to the future. It was the taste of our cheddar, the smell of the aging cellar, the dignity of honest work. Tiffany didn't just want to move me into a home. She wanted to erase all of this, to replace it with a logo and a marketing plan. Was Arthur's fleeting happiness worth the cost of his entire inheritance, his entire history? I thought about the kind of man he was, raised on this farm. He was kind, trusting, and a little naive. Tiffany would chew him up and spit him out once she had what she wanted. He thought he was gaining a partner, but he was being acquired by a predator. Protecting the creamery was protecting him from his own blindness. The conflict wasn't mother versus fiancé. It was legacy versus greed. It was preservation versus destruction. The weight of the decision settled on me, not as a burden, but as a mantle of responsibility. Robert hadn't left me a weapon to start a war. He had left me a shield to protect our home. I wouldn't confront them. I wouldn't make a scene or give Tiffany the satisfaction of a fight. That wasn't my way. And it wasn't Robert's way. The best cheese is made with patience. The sharpest flavors develop slowly, in the cool and the dark. I would let her believe she was winning. I would let her walk down that aisle, smiling her brilliant, false smile. A strange calm washed over me. The path forward was clear, though it was fraught with pain. I would not be the aggressor. I would be the guardian. I would let the wedding proceed. I would sit in the front pew and smile, a quiet old woman in a lavender dress. I would let Tiffany believe she had won, that the old matriarch was a gentle, fading presence, a piece of furniture soon to be discarded. Let her underestimate me. Let her believe I was dead weight. It would make her inevitable discovery of the matriarch's clause all the more shocking. I carefully folded the letter and the legal documents, slipping them back into the thick manila envelope. I didn't return it to the drawer. I took it with me, up the creaking stairs to my bedroom. I placed it not in my safe, but in my knitting basket, hidden beneath balls of soft merino wool. It was an absurdly domestic hiding place for such a powerful document, but it felt right. She would search for power in vaults and bank boxes. She would never think to look for it amongst the simple, useful things a woman keeps. Lying in bed, I watched the first pale hints of dawn creep over the mountains. The birds began their morning chorus, oblivious to the silent battle lines that had been drawn in the night. The air still felt heavy, but not with dread anymore. It was heavy with purpose. Tiffany was planning her future. a future built on the ashes of my life. She had no idea that I was now planning mine, a future where the Caldwell legacy would be protected by the very woman she had so carelessly dismissed. I thought of the toast she made, to a bold, new future. She had no idea how bold it was about to become. The rehearsal was over. The performance was about to begin. And I, Margaret Caldwell, the quiet, useless old woman, knew my role perfectly. I would be the loving mother-in-law, the gracious hostess, the keeper of family traditions. I would play my part until the moment was right. And when that moment came, I would show her what it truly means to be the matriarch of this family. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, clear resolve. This was not about revenge. Revenge is a hot, messy thing. This was about justice. It was about honoring a promise made to my husband and protecting the future for a son who could not protect himself. I closed my eyes, not to sleep, but to plan. The wedding was in 2 days. Tiffany thought it was her coronation. In truth, it was going to be her reckoning. The storm Robert had warned me about was here, and I was ready to stand in the eye of it. I finally drifted off to a shallow sleep just as the sun crested the mountains, flooding my room with light. My dreams were not of arguments or confrontations, but of Robert, standing on the porch, smiling at me. He didn't say anything. He just gave a slight, knowing nod, as if to say, "I knew you could handle it, Maggie." I woke up feeling a profound sense of peace. The doubt had been purged. The turning point had been reached and crossed. I was no longer a victim of Tiffany's plot. I was the architect of her downfall. My morning routine was the same as always. I went to my garden, the cool earth beneath my feet, a familiar comfort. I crushed a sprig of rosemary between my fingers, the sharp, clean scent clearing the last vestiges of sleep from my mind. Today, the scent wasn't just a comfort. It was a reminder of resilience, of things that grow stronger in harsh conditions. I felt a kinship with the stubborn herbs that clung to the rocky soil. We were survivors. When Arthur came into the kitchen for coffee, he looked tired but euphoric. "Morning, Mom. Big day tomorrow." He kissed my cheek, oblivious to the iron resolve that had formed in my heart overnight. "Are you feeling better? You were so quiet last night." I poured him a cup of coffee, my hand perfectly steady. "I'm feeling much better, dear," I said, my voice even and calm. "Just a little tired. But I wouldn't miss your wedding for the world. It's going to be a day none of us will ever forget." He smiled, satisfied with my answer, and began talking about his honeymoon plans, about the future. I listened, nodding in all the right places, my mind a quiet, whirring machine. He saw a loving mother. Tiffany saw a feeble old woman. They were both wrong. They saw what they wanted to see. They had no idea they were looking at the calm, patient, and unmovable heart of the Caldwell Creamery. And the heart was about to remind them that it was still beating. The morning of the wedding dawned crisp and painfully beautiful. The Vermont sky a shade of blue so deep it seemed to hold its breath. My first test began in my own kitchen. Tiffany swept in, a whirlwind of white silk and expensive floral perfume that overpowered the familiar scent of my coffee. She placed a perfectly manicured hand on my arm, her touch feeling like a brand. "Margaret, I am just so thrilled we're finally going to be family," she said, her smile a masterpiece of practiced sincerity. My first instinct, a raw, primal urge, was to pull away. I felt my muscles tense, but then I remembered the long game. Instead, I placed my own weathered hand over hers, a gesture that cost me every ounce of self-control. "As am I, dear," I replied, my voice a stranger in my own ears. That first small victory, that lie successfully told, felt both like a betrayal of myself and a necessary first step. It was a stumble. My voice was too tight, my smile too brittle, but it was a start. I learned in that moment that this new role required more than just silence. It required performance. Throughout the morning, as bridesmaids flitted about the house like nervous sparrows, I practiced. I focused on the mundane, on the rhythm of my breathing, on the weight of the silver teapot in my hand as I poured. I was no longer just Margaret. I was an actress learning her lines, And the stage was my own home, my own life. The drive to the old stone church in Woodstock was a blur of green hills and my son's anxious chatter. Arthur, sitting beside me in the back of the car, was so lost in his own happiness that he was blind to the war being waged in the silence next to him. He squeezed my hand. "Are you happy for me, Mom?" The question was so pure, so honest, it felt like a knife twisting in my gut. This was my deepest internal conflict. Protecting him meant deceiving him. "Of course, my love," I whispered, forcing a warmth I did not feel. "All I've ever wanted is your happiness." And that, at least, was the truth, though he could never understand. The shape of it now. Sitting in the front pew, the hard oak pressing into my back, I felt 1,000 eyes on me. I was the grieving widow, the proud mother, the benevolent matriarch. I had to be all of them and none of them. As Tiffany walked down the aisle, a vision in lace, I did not see a bride. I saw a conqueror arriving to claim her prize. I watched Arthur's face light up, and in that moment, I felt a wave of fear so profound it almost buckled me. What if I was wrong? What if this was real love, and I was about to destroy it out of pride and bitterness? The old Margaret, the mother, screamed at me to stop, to let him have this moment, this dream. But then I looked at Tiffany's father, a man with the same hard, appraising eyes as his daughter, and I saw him scan the church not with paternal pride, but as if he were estimating its property value. The doubt vanished, replaced by a cold, clarifying anger. My new discipline took over. I stopped seeing the wedding as a family event and began to see it as a business merger. I started truly listening to the whispers around me, not just hearing them. The talk from her side of the aisle was all about potential, scaling up, and new markets. They were not welcoming a son. They were acquiring an asset. At the reception, held under a grand white tent on the lawn of a country club, the assault became more direct. Tiffany, now officially Mrs. Caldwell, made a toast. She raised her glass, her diamond ring catching the light. "To the Caldwell Creamery," she said, her voice ringing with false reverence, "and to the bold new direction we'll be taking it in, honoring the past, but embracing a more profitable future." It was a declaration of intent, a thinly veiled dismissal of everything Robert and I stood for. The guests from Boston applauded enthusiastically. My own neighbors and our creamery workers shifted uncomfortably. They knew. They understood the language of the land, and they heard the threat. Later, as the band played, Arthur brought me a slice of cake, his face flushed with wine and joy. "Isn't this perfect, Mom?" he asked. I saw Tiffany in the background, laughing with a man who I recognized as a ruthless real estate developer from Burlington. The contrast between my son's innocent joy and her calculated networking was jarring. "It's a beautiful party, Arthur," I said, the words carefully chosen. I couldn't bring myself to call it perfect. My inability to lie completely was a weakness I had to overcome. He looked at me, a flicker of concern in his eyes. "You seem distant." This was the external conflict I feared most, my son noticing the cracks in my performance. "Just emotional, dear," I deflected, patting his hand. "It's a big day." It was a weak excuse, but it was enough. He was too happy to probe deeper. But the encounter shook me. I realized that my transformation had to be more than just a defensive posture. It had to become proactive. The next day, after the newlyweds had left for their honeymoon in Italy, I did not rest. I went back to Robert's study, but this time I wasn't looking for a single document. I began a new habit. Every morning for 3 hours, I studied. I read every contract, every supplier agreement, every financial report from the last 10 years. I was relearning the language of my own life's work. The first week was a struggle. The numbers blurred, the legal jargon felt like a foreign language, and the temptation to simply retreat to my garden was immense. Old thoughts crept back in the quiet hours of the night. Voices that sounded like Tiffany's, telling me I was too old, that I didn't understand this new world. I would wake up in a cold sweat, the fear of failure a heavy blanket. What if she was right? What if my stubbornness was just pride, and I was the one holding the business back? The battle against my own insecurity was more draining than any public performance. But with each passing day, a new strength began to form. I started making notes, connecting dots I hadn't seen before. I saw how Tiffany had subtly influenced Arthur to switch to a cheaper, inferior grain supplier from one of her Boston connections. I saw the proposal for a new packaging design that would erase the drawing of the old farmhouse from the label. These were not just suggestions. They were deliberate acts of erasure. My fear began to burn away, replaced by the cold, hard fuel of purpose. My discipline was no longer a chore. It was my armor. The external challenges came quickly. The creamery manager, a good man named Bill, who had worked for us for 30 years, called me. His voice troubled. "Margaret, Arthur called from Italy. He said Tiffany's consultant is coming next week to assess our operational inefficiencies. Do you know anything about this?" I felt a chill, but my voice was steady. "I do, Bill. Don't worry. Just be polite, answer his questions, and send me a full report of everything he asks." I was no longer on the defensive. I was gathering intelligence. When the consultant, a slick young man in a suit that looked out of place on our gravel driveway, arrived, I was ready. I happened to be in the creamery, wearing my old work apron. I listened quietly as he spoke of automation, of reducing aging time, of diversifying into flavored cheese products. He spoke to Bill as if I wasn't even there, another old fixture to be ignored. This was a critical test. The old me would have stayed silent, intimidated. The new me stepped forward. "Our cheddar's sharpness comes from aging no less than 2 years in a constant temperature," I stated, my voice calm but carrying the weight of 50 years of experience. "The granite walls of this cellar provide that. Your climate-controlled rooms can't replicate the terroir." The consultant looked at me, surprised. "And our customers don't buy flavored cheese products from us," I continued, my confidence growing with each word. "They buy Caldwell. Cheddar. They buy the story. You automate that, you kill the story. You kill the brand." He was speechless for a moment, his well-rehearsed pitch dismantled by simple, undeniable facts. He tried to argue, citing market trends and profit margins, but I countered every point with a quiet, unshakable knowledge of our craft, our customers, our very soul. Bill watched, a slow smile spreading across his face. The consultant left an hour later, looking flustered, his binder of charts and graphs seeming flimsy and useless against the weight of authentic tradition. I had not raised my voice. I had not been emotional. I had simply used the truth as a weapon. That small victory was a turning point. It was the first time I had actively wielded my power. Not the legal power from Robert's will, but the personal power of my own knowledge and history. The fear of confrontation began to recede, replaced by a growing sense of my own capability. I started making quiet phone calls to old friends on the town board, to our longtime distributors, not to complain, but to reconnect, to subtly reinforce the old alliances that Tiffany was trying to sever. I was shoring up my defenses, brick by brick. The internal conflict hadn't vanished, but it had changed. The guilt over deceiving Arthur remained, a dull ache in my heart, but it was now outweighed by the certainty that I was protecting him from a future of profound regret. I was not just saving a business. I was fighting for my son's soul, for the part of him that was still connected to this land, to his father's memory. My actions were no longer born of fear or a desire for revenge. They were born of a fierce, protective love. A few days later, a glossy magazine arrived in the mail, addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Arthur Caldwell. It was a high-end real estate publication specializing in luxury senior living. It was bookmarked to a page featuring a gleaming, soulless facility in Florida, complete with a golf course and gourmet dining. It was a message, a clear and deliberate threat sent from across the ocean. They were coming home soon, and the next phase of their plan was about to begin. I looked at the picture of smiling, silver-haired strangers playing shuffleboard under a palm tree. A month ago, this would have crushed me. It would have been proof of my impending obsolescence, a symbol of everything I was about to lose. I felt a flicker of the old pain, the sting of being seen as a burden. It was a ghost of a feeling, an echo from a woman I used to be. The thought of being sent away from my home, from the smell of the earth after a rain, from the comfort of Robert's empty chair, was still a painful one. But then I looked out the window at the rolling green hills, at the solid, unmoving presence of the old barn, my hills, my home. I felt the weight of Robert's trust, the power of his foresight resting in my knitting basket upstairs. The magazine was not a threat. It was a tactical error. It was a sign of Tiffany's impatience, her arrogance. She had shown her hand too early, assuming I was a passive old woman who would be frightened into compliance. I took the magazine and walked into the kitchen. I did not tear it up in a fit of rage. That would have been the old Margaret's response, an act of pure, powerless emotion. Instead, I calmly and methodically used it to line the bottom of the compost bin under the sink, where I would soon dump the day's coffee grounds and vegetable peels. It was a small, quiet act, unseen by anyone. But for me, it was a profound declaration. I was discarding her threat, turning her polished, cruel intentions into nourishment for the soil of my garden. As I closed the cabinet door, I caught my reflection in the dark glass of the oven. I saw the lines on my face, the silver in my hair, but for the first time in a long time, I didn't see fragility. I saw the woman who had stood up to the consultant, the woman who was methodically relearning her own empire, the woman who was quietly lining up her chess pieces while her opponent was still celebrating a victory that wasn't real. I was no longer the same person who had stood trembling behind that door at the rehearsal dinner. The fear of failure was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. The thoughts of my own weakness had been silenced by the rediscovery of my own strength. I was not just a mother or a widow anymore. I was Margaret Caldwell, the heart of the Caldwell Creamery, and I was not a piece of old furniture to be discarded. I was the foundation of the entire house, and I was about to remind everyone just how deep my roots went. The honeymoon was almost over, and I was ready for them. They came back from Italy glowing with the kind of tans that speak of expensive wine and afternoons spent by the sea. Tiffany swept back into the farmhouse not as a guest, but as a new monarch, her voice echoing in the halls as she directed the placement of luggage and art they'd bought. The air, once thick with the comfortable scent of old wood and baking bread, was now sharp with her perfume, an invasive scent of conquest. She looked at me, her smile bright and possessive, and announced there would be a family business meeting in the dining room the next morning. It wasn't a request, it was a summons. She was ready to claim her kingdom. The next day, I sat at the head of the long oak dining table, a place that had been mine for nearly 50 years. The contrast to the woman I had been just weeks before was staggering. Then, I had been a ghost at my own feast, trembling and invisible. Now, I felt a stillness inside me, a weight as solid as the granite mountains. I watched Tiffany set up her laptop, the click of her heels on the hardwood floor like a countdown. Arthur sat between us, looking nervous but excited, a man trying to serve two queens, utterly unaware one was about to be checkmated. He saw a bright future. I saw a carefully laid trap about to be sprung. Tiffany began her presentation, her voice smooth and confident as she clicked through slides filled with charts and aggressive marketing language. Rebranding, leveraging assets, streamlining for maximum profitability. She spoke of our cheese not as food, not as a legacy, but as a product unit. I listened without expression, my hands folded calmly in my lap. I let her speak, let her lay out her entire vision of destruction, cloaked in the language of progress. I gave her the space to reveal the full extent of her ambition, letting her build her own gallows, one corporate buzzword at a time. Then came the final slide, the one I had been waiting for. It was titled Strategic Human Capital Realignment. On the screen was a glossy photo of a sprawling complex in Florida, complete with palm trees and a golf course. "We've found the most wonderful luxury community for you, Margaret," she said, her voice dripping with false concern. "You've worked so hard. You deserve a permanent vacation," Arthur chimed in, his voice earnest. "It's beautiful, Mom. You'd be so comfortable." This was it. The moment of my official discarding, presented on a silver platter of condescension. I let the silence hang in the room for a long moment, savoring the look of triumphant finality on Tiffany's face. I did not look at the screen. I looked directly at her. Then I turned my gaze to my son, whose eyes were pleading with me to understand, to accept, to fade away gracefully. The woman from the rehearsal dinner would have cried. She would have pleaded, but I was not her anymore. I simply said, my voice quiet but filling the entire room, "That won't be necessary, and it won't be possible." The shift in the room was immediate. Tiffany's smile faltered, a tiny crack in a perfect facade. Arthur looked confused. From my knitting basket, which I had placed on the chair beside me, I retrieved the thick manila envelope. The wax seal was already broken. I didn't say a word. I simply slid it across the polished surface of the table toward my son. The sound of the paper on the wood was the only noise in the room, a dry, final whisper that cut through all of Tiffany's polished projections. Arthur picked it up, his brow furrowed in confusion. Tiffany leaned in, her curiosity warring with her irritation. As my son unfolded the pages, I watched his face. I saw the moment his eyes scanned the title, The Matriarch's Clause. I saw the flicker of disbelief, followed by the slow, dawning comprehension that washed the color from his cheeks. He read it once, then again, his lips moving silently. The air grew thick, heavy with the unspoken words of a dead man whose foresight was more powerful than any living ambition. "What is it?" Tiffany demanded, her voice sharp, impatient. Arthur didn't answer. He just stared at the page, then looked at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and something else, a sliver of respect. He finally passed the document to his wife. I watched her snatch it from his hand. I watched her scan the legal text, her perfectly made-up face contorting as she read the lines that bound my life to the life of the creamery, the lines that made me not dead weight, but the anchor of the entire enterprise. Her mask did not just crack, it shattered. The polished Boston executive vanished, replaced by a raw, furious entitlement. "This is ridiculous. It's archaic," she hissed, her voice thin and sharp. "You planned this. You manipulative old woman. You sat there and let us—" She stopped, catching herself, but it was too late. The word "us" hung in the air, a confession of her complicity. She wasn't just supporting Arthur. She had been the architect of the entire plan to oust me. "Robert was a wise man," I said, my voice still calm, still even. "He didn't believe in progress that forgets the past. He believed in protecting his family, all of his family." I looked at Arthur, whose face was a canvas of shame and dawning horror. He was finally seeing the woman beside. Him not as the brilliant partner he adored, but as the predator his father had foreseen. He was seeing the cold calculation that I had been forced to see weeks ago. The fight went out of Tiffany in an instant, replaced by a cold, venomous fury. She knew she had lost. There was no loophole, no way around the simple, ironclad will of a Vermont farmer. She stood up so abruptly her chair scraped loudly against the floor. She gave me a look of pure, unadulterated hatred, a look that held no pretense of family or affection. "You've ruined everything," she spat, before turning and storming out of the room, leaving a trail of expensive, defeated perfume in her wake. A few moments later, we heard the sound of her car engine roaring to life, followed by the spray of gravel as she sped down the driveway, away from the farmhouse, away from the legacy she had tried and failed to conquer. The silence she left behind was profound, broken only by the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the Bay Hall. Arthur sat frozen, the legal papers still in his hand, the ghost of his future crumbling around him. He wouldn't look at me. I didn't press him. I didn't say, "I told you so." The victory was not in proving myself right, but in saving him from a mistake that would have cost him his soul. I simply stood, walked over to the sideboard and poured 2 cups of coffee, the familiar ritual a small anchor in the storm. I placed one in front of him. "Drink your coffee, Arthur," I said gently. He finally looked up at me, his eyes filled with a confusion so deep it broke my heart. "Mom, I didn't—" he started, his voice choked. "I know," I said. And I did. I knew he was blinded by love, by a desire to build something bigger, by the promises of a woman who spoke a language of ambition he found intoxicating. Later that day, I showed him the other things I had found. The invoices from the inferior grain supplier, the marketing proposals that would have erased his grandparents' faces from our story, the real estate magazine. I laid out the evidence not as an accuser, but as a teacher, showing him the parts of the world he had refused to see. The weeks that followed were quiet and heavy. The divorce papers arrived from a Boston law firm, cold and impersonal. Arthur walked through the days like a man in a trance, grieving not just for a marriage, but for the dream he had believed in. I gave him his space, but I was always there, in the kitchen in the morning, in the creamery in the afternoon. I didn't offer platitudes or easy forgiveness. I offered consistency. I offered the steady, unchanging rhythm of the farm, a rhythm he had forgotten how to hear. Slowly, he began to return. He started joining me in the aging cellar, not as a manager, but as an apprentice. I taught him how to tap a wheel of cheddar and listen for the subtle echoes that signal a perfect texture, a secret my husband had taught me 50 years ago. I saw a new kind of respect in his eyes, not the dutiful affection of a son for his mother, but the genuine admiration of one professional for another. We were not just mother and son anymore. We were partners, guardians of a shared trust. One afternoon, Bill, our creamery manager, stopped me by the door. He had a quiet smile on his face, the first I'd seen in months. "It's good to have you back, Margaret," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's good to have the real Caldwell Creamery back." It was then I realized my conquest was not just over, Tiffany. It was a reclamation of my own identity. The community, our employees, they had never seen me as dead weight. That was a fiction created by greed. They had simply been waiting for the matriarch to remind everyone why she was the heart of this place. My transformation was complete, but it wasn't a return to who I was before. I was someone new. The woman who once trembled behind a door, listening to her own erasure, was gone forever. In her place was a woman who understood that silence is not weakness, and that age is not a liability, but a library of knowledge and experience. I had been forced to reread every chapter of my own life, to relearn its value, and in doing so, I found a strength I never knew I possessed. I look at my reflection now in the dark windows of the farmhouse at night, and I no longer see just a wrinkled old woman. I see a survivor. I see a guardian. I see the living embodiment of my husband's love and foresight. I see a woman who was underestimated, dismissed, and very nearly discarded, but who found her power not in shouting, but in the quiet, unshakable truth of who she was and what she had built. The victory wasn't loud or explosive. It was as quiet and certain as the sun rising over the green mountains. This journey taught me something profound. It taught me that we often allow the world to write our definition. We let others tell us when we are past our prime, when we are no longer useful, when it is time to step aside. We listen to the loud voices of ambition and novelty and forget the quiet power of our own deep roots. My story is not just about a farm or a family inheritance. It's about the moment you decide to stop listening to their definitions and start remembering your own. There is a strength and experience that youth cannot comprehend. There is a wisdom and patience that impatience can never defeat. Never let anyone convince you that your story is over, that your chapter is done. Sometimes the most important work of your life begins the moment someone else declares you finished. Your value is not determined by your utility to others, but by the legacy you carry within you, by the knowledge you've earned, and by the quiet dignity with which you refuse to be erased. So, I ask you to look at the elders in your own life, and to look at the elder you may one day become. Do not see fragility. See resilience. Do not see obsolescence. See a library of priceless knowledge. And if you ever feel like you are being pushed to the margins, that your voice is being silenced, remember the quiet power of a Vermont farmer's will. Remember that the oldest trees have the deepest roots, and they are the hardest to knock down. I am Margaret Caldwell. I am 78 years old, and I am not dead weight. I am the gatekeeper. I am the matriarch. And my work here, I've decided, is far from over. In fact, I feel as though it has just begun. The creamery is safe, my son is learning, and the cheddar has never tasted sharper. This is my conquest, and this is my message. Do not go quietly. Let your life be a testament to the fact that you are and always will be useful.